All right, so let's be honest. Dealing with vehicle registration and wading through all those legal documents can feel like you're trying to solve a puzzle in the dark.
Yeah, kind of a headache, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing is, understanding what all of that stuff actually means can actually make your driving life so much easier.
Less stressful for sure.
Less stressful, exactly. It's all about knowing the rules of the road and taking those simple steps to avoid any unpleasant surprises down the road. And you'd be surprised how many people actually get tripped up by these little details. Like, did you know that you can actually get in trouble for displaying your temporary registration number incorrectly?
It's true. A lot of people don't realize that.
So in India, the Central Motor Vehicles Rules, or CMVR, lays out specific regulations for how that temporary number needs to be displayed.
Right, and there are good reasons for those rules.
So for our listener who's maybe just bought a new car, what exactly is temporary registration and why is it so important to get it right?
Well, basically, it's like a provisional license for your new car, so it lets you legally drive it off the lot and use it for a limited time while you're waiting for the permanent registration to be processed.
Makes sense.
But it's important to display that temporary number correctly.
So just writing it on a piece of paper and sticking it to the windshield is a no-go.
Definitely not. And you could even face penalties for that.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it's partly because of all the cameras on the roads now with automatic number plate readers. Those cameras need to be able to read the registration information accurately.
Oh, that makes sense.
And there's also the issue of security.
Security,
hmm
how does that tie into the registration number?
Well, unfortunately, there have been instances where cars with temporary registration numbers, especially if they're not displayed properly, have been used for illegal activities.
Oh, wow.
So a properly displayed number acts as a deterrent, and it adds an extra layer of security.
I never thought about it that way, but that's a really good point. So what is the right way to display a temporary registration number?
Yeah, the CMVR has specific guidelines, but basically the number has to be clearly visible, it has to be easy to read,
Yeah.
and it has to be on something durable, not just a flimsy piece of paper.
Right, something that won't, blow off in the wind.
Exactly. Your dealership should be able to guide you on this, but if you're ever unsure, it's always best to check with your local RTO.
Solid advice. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about insurance.
hmm
There's this myth going around that if you're driving with a temporary registration, you can't claim insurance if you get into an accident.
Ah, yes, the dreaded insurance myth.
So can you debunk that for us? Is there any truth to that?
Not at all. It's completely false. Having a temporary registration doesn't mean you can't make an insurance claim.
That's good to know.
The key here, just like with so many things related to vehicle compliance, is transparency.
Okay, so what does transparency mean in this case?
When you're insuring a vehicle with a temporary registration, you need to be upfront with your insurance company and provide them with all the necessary documentation things like the bill of sale, your temporary registration certificate, anything that shows proof of ownership.
So it's all about clear communication and having all your ducks in a row.
Exactly. And this is especially important if you do need to file a claim. Being transparent and giving accurate information to your insurance company can really make the process a lot smoother.
Got it. So transparency is key. Now, let's say you're driving along, minding your own business, following all the rules, and suddenly you see those flashing red and blue lights in your rearview mirror.
Oh.
Yeah. Any tips on how to handle a traffic stop smoothly, even if you haven't broken any rules?
First and foremost, stay calm and be polite. A little cooperation can go a long way.
Don't get defensive.
Right. It's important to remember that traffic stops are a part of ensuring road safety.
Yeah. They're not always about catching someone doing something wrong. Sometimes it's just a routine check.
Right. And it's helpful to understand that both you and the traffic officer have certain rights.
Okay, so what are the officer's rights in this situation?
Well, they have the right to verify your identity, check your documents, things like that, and they can also conduct a breathalyzer test if they suspect you've been drinking. And of course, they have the authority to issue challenges or tickets if you have violated a rule.
Right, that makes sense. And what about the driver? What rights do I have if I'm stopped by an officer?
You have the right to ask why you've been stopped and to refuse a vehicle search unless the officer has a valid reason to suspect you've done something wrong. And if you do receive a challenge, make sure it clearly states what rule you've allegedly violated.
So that I can, contest it if I think it's unfair.
Exactly. So it's all about understanding your rights and exercising them respectfully.
So speaking of rights, this brings up an important point. What documents should every driver in India have readily available to avoid any issues during a traffic stop?
The essentials are your driving license, of course, and the vehicle registration certificate, a valid pollution under control certificate, and proof of insurance.
Makes sense. And what about digital copies? Are those generally accepted in India? I know a lot of people use apps like DigiLocker to store their documents digitally.
Yes, digitally uploaded documents are generally accepted. However, it's always a good idea to also have physical copies,
Yeah.
just in case there are any technical issues or if the officer prefers to see the physical document.
So it's like having a backup just in case.
Exactly. It's always better to be safe than sorry.
Okay, now we've talked about the CMVR and traffic stops, but what about the big one, the Motor Vehicles Act? That seems like it's the foundation of all the rules of the road.
It is the Motor Vehicles Act of 1988. It's the backbone of all vehicle regulations in India. It covers everything from licensing and registration to traffic rules and insurance requirements. It's kind of like the ultimate rule book for Indian roads.
So for our listener who wants to stay on the right side of the law, avoid those penalties, what are some key sections of the Motor Vehicles Act that they should really know about?
Well, Section 39 is a good place to start. It emphasizes the fact that vehicle registration is mandatory. And then there's Section 185, which deals with driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and the penalties for that are very serious.
Definitely don't drink and drive.
Absolutely. And as we've already touched on, Section 192 outlines the consequences of driving without proper registration.
So those are some big ones to remember. Are there any other things drivers can do apart from knowing these specific sections to stay ahead of the curve and ensure they're complying with all the rules?
Absolutely. One of the easiest and most important things you can do is to regularly check the validity of your documents.
So like making sure my license hasn't expired.
Exactly. Those deadlines can sneak up on you. So set reminders on your phone, use a calendar app, whatever works for you, but make it a habit to check the expiry dates of your driving license, vehicle registration, and your insurance policy.
It's easy to forget about those things until it's too late.
It is, and it can save you a lot of hassle in the long run.
Okay, so regular document checks. What else?
Stay informed. Traffic rules and regulations are not set in stone. They can change, so make it a habit to check for any updates specific to your state or region.
So where's the best place to find that information?
Your local RTO website is a great resource, and many states have dedicated online portals for vehicle-related services. Also, keep an eye on the news. Good old-fashioned news sources, they'll often report on any significant changes to traffic laws.
That's a good point. I often forget to check those sources for those types of updates.
It's easy to overlook, but it's worth doing.
Okay, so we've got document checks, stay informed, and
And this is a big one. Embrace online resources. So much can be done online now. Things like renewing your registration, applying for permits, even comparing insurance quotes from different providers. It can save you so much time and hassle.
I remember when everything had to be done in person at the RPO, and it was such a long and tedious
Oh,
process.
yeah, it can be a real pain.
But now, with everything moving online, it's so much more convenient.
Definitely, it's all about using technology to your advantage.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about temporary registration, the importance of displaying it correctly, how to handle a traffic stop smoothly, and we even dove into the Motor Vehicles Act.
It seems like a lot, but having this knowledge can really make your life as a driver in India much easier.
And potentially save you from some hefty fines, too.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something that often causes confusion, claiming insurance with a temporary registration number.
Okay, let's clear that up.
So can you file an insurance claim if you're driving with a temporary registration?
Yes, you absolutely can. Just because you have a temporary registration doesn't mean you're not covered by insurance or that you can't make a claim if you need to.
That's a relief to hear.
But are there any specific things drivers should keep in mind when making a claim with a temporary registration?
That's a good question. What should they do?
The most important thing, just like we discussed earlier, is transparency. Be upfront with your insurance company. Tell them that you have a temporary registration. Provide them with all the relevant document, the bill of sale, the temporary registration certificate, and give them a clear account of what happened.
So it's all about honesty and providing accurate information.
Precisely, the more transparent you are, the smoother the claims process will be.
Makes sense. Now let's circle back to those sometimes uncomfortable encounters with traffic police. We've talked about knowing your rights, but are there any practical tips for making that interaction as painless as possible?
Well, remember that first tip, stay calm and be polite. It can de-escalate a potentially tense situation. Even if you feel like you've done nothing wrong, getting defensive or argumentative is only going to make things more difficult.
I know it's easier said than done sometimes, especially when you're caught off guard.
Yeah, I know, but try to take a deep breath and remind yourself that you do have rights. You can politely ask why you've been stopped, and you can refuse a search of your vehicle unless the officer has a valid reason to believe you've done something wrong.
And what if they ask to see my documents?
Always have them ready. Keep your driving license, registration, pollution certificate, and insurance proof somewhere easily accessible in your car so you're not scrambling to find them.
That's good advice. I need to be better about that.
It can really reduce the stress of the situation for both you and the officer.
Now, what if you're pulled over and the officer accuses you of a traffic violation, but you're certain you didn't do anything wrong? How should you handle that?
Well, it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes, even traffic officers. If you believe you've been wrongly accused, stay calm, be respectful, and try to clearly explain why you think there's been a misunderstanding.
So communication is key.
It is, and if you have any evidence to support your side of the story, like dash cam footage, for example, politely mention that to the officer. It could be helpful in resolving the situation.
Okay, what if despite your best efforts to explain yourself, the officer is insistent that you broke a rule?
Well, if you genuinely believe you're being wrongly accused and the officer is not receptive to your explanation, you do have the right to contest the challenge. However, it's really important to do so through the proper legal channels.
So no arguing with the officer on the side of the road.
It's very rarely productive.
Mm,
It's much better to calmly and politely state your disagreement and then follow the established procedures for contesting the challenge, which usually means going to court.
got it. So know your rights, but also know the proper channels for exercising those rights.
Exactly. And speaking of legal procedures, we've talked a lot about the Motor Vehicles Act today. We touched on some key sections earlier. Are there any others that you think are particularly relevant for everyday drivers in India?
Yes, actually, there are a couple more that are worth highlighting. Section 112 deals with speed limits, which obviously everyone needs to be aware of. And then there's Section 130, which outlines your duty to produce your license and registration certificate if a police officer asks to see them. So it's not just about knowing the rules. It's also about being able to prove that you're following them.
Exactly. Having those documents ready to go can make a big difference in how a traffic stop unfolds.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of practical tips for avoiding penalties and
Mhm.
ensuring compliance. But let's zoom out for a moment and think about the bigger picture.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
We both know that vehicle regulations are there for a reason, to keep everyone safe on the roads and to maintain order. But are there any downsides to the current system in India, or areas where it could be improved?
That's a great question, and it's one that's constantly being debated. One of the most common criticisms is that the process for registering a vehicle and getting all the necessary permits can be quite bureaucratic and time consuming.
I can definitely relate to that. Filling out all those forms and going through the RTO procedures can be a real headache.
It can be, and another area that people often talk about is the enforcement of traffic laws. There have been some improvements, especially with the use of technology, like we talked about earlier, but there's always room for greater consistency and transparency in how traffic violations are handled.
So it's not just about having rules, it's about making sure they're applied fairly and effectively across the board.
Exactly. And then there's the ongoing conversation about how technology can be used to make the entire system more efficient and user-friendly.
Ah, yes, the future of vehicle registration and compliance. We briefly touched on this earlier, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how technology might shape this landscape in the coming years in India.
Well, we're already seeing a shift towards digitalization with many RTO services moving online, and I think this trend is only going to accelerate in the coming years. It could even lead to a scenario where much of the registration and permit process can be done completely remotely.
Wow, imagine that, renewing your registration or applying for a permit from the comfort of your own home without having to set foot in an RTO office.
It could become a reality, but of course, with any technological advancement, there are also potential challenges that need to be addressed.
Like what?
Well, data security is paramount. Any digital system used for vehicle registration and compliance has to be very secure to protect sensitive personal information from unauthorized access and misuse.
That's a crucial point. We can't just blindly embrace technology without considering the potential risks.
Exactly. Another challenge is ensuring accessibility. Not everyone in India has equal access to technology or the same level of digital literacy, so we need to make sure that any digital solutions developed for vehicle registration are inclusive and don't create barriers for certain segments of the population.
So it's about striking that balance between leveraging technology for efficiency and making sure the system remains accessible and equitable for everyone.
You've summed it up perfectly. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that's worth tackling in order to create a more streamlined and user-friendly experience for all drivers in India. So welcome back to our deep dive into vehicle registration and compliance.
Yeah, I'm glad we're back. I feel like we've already learned so much just in that first part. Like, I can't believe you can get penalized for not displaying your temporary registration number correctly.
Right? Like, who knew?
Seriously, it's like those little details that can really trip you up. So for all the Legum doctors out there listening who want to avoid those kind of surprises, let's recap some of those quick tips we've talked about for staying on the right side of the law.
Okay, yeah. So, number one, regular document checks. Don't wait until the last minute to realize your driving license has expired or your vehicle registration is out of date.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that myself. Those deadlines just sneak up on you.
They really do. So set reminders on your phone, use a calendar app, whatever works for you. Just make sure you're checking those expiry dates regularly for your license registration and insurance policy.
Okay, so document checks are crucial. What else?
Stay informed. Traffic laws, they're not set in stone, they change. So make it a habit to check for any updates in your state or region.
Okay, so where do I go for that info?
The best place to start is your local RTO website. A lot of states also have dedicated online portals for vehicle-related services. And don't forget about the news. They often report on any major changes to traffic laws.
That's a good point. I usually just check the RTO website, so we'll have to remember to check the news too.
Yeah, it's easy to forget, but it's worth keeping an eye out for those updates.
Okay, so we've got document checks,
Mm-hmm.
stay informed about rule changes, and
And don't forget to take advantage of all the online resources that are available these days. So many things can be done online now, like renewing your registration, applying for permits. You can even compare insurance quotes from different providers, all from the comfort of your own home.
oh yeah, I love that. I remember back in the day when you had to go to the RTO for everything and spend hours waiting in line.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
It really was.
Yeah.
So yeah, online services are definitely a game changer.
Definitely makes life a lot easier.
All right, so let's get back to those traffic stops. We talked about staying calm, knowing your rights. But any other practical tips for making those interactions as painless as possible?
Yeah, a big one is just be prepared, have your documents ready to go. Driving license, registration certificate, pollution certificate, and insurance proof. Keep them organized and easily accessible in your car.
No more frantic digging through the glove compartment.
Exactly. And remember, while you do have rights, it's important to exercise them respectfully. If you're asked for your documents, provide them politely and without any fuss.
Okay, and what if you genuinely believe you've been wrongly accused of a violation like we talked about before?
Right, stay calm, be respectful, and clearly explain why you think there's been a misunderstanding. If you have any evidence to support your claim, like dash cam footage, let the officer know.
But what if, despite your best efforts to explain yourself, the officer still insists that you broke a rule? What then?
If you truly believe you're being wrongly penalized and the officer isn't listening to you, you do have the right to contest the challenge, but you have to do it through the proper legal
So
channels.
no arguing with the officer right there on the spot.
It's really not going to help. It's much better to calmly disagree and then follow the correct procedures for contesting the challenge, which usually means going to court.
Okay, got it. So know your rights, but also know how to use them properly.
Exactly.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the how-tos of compliance, but I think it's also important to understand the why behind all these rules and
Oh,
regulations.
yeah, for sure. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the details that we forget the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why do we have these regulations in the first place for vehicles in India?
Well, at the most basic level, they're all about safety, keeping our roads safe, and protecting everyone who uses them: drivers, passengers, pedestrians, cyclists, everyone.
So it's not just about avoiding fines, it's about being a responsible driver and creating a safer environment for everyone.
Exactly. Think about it for a second. Having a system of vehicle registration helps to track vehicles, which is important for preventing and investigating crime.
Oh, right. I never thought about that. But that makes sense.
And then you have the rules about ensuring vehicles are roadworthy and meet certain safety standards. That's all about reducing accidents and saving lives.
Yeah, those are obviously important.
And of course, there are the regulations around insurance, which are there to protect everyone involved if there is an accident.
So basically, when we follow these rules, we're not just mindlessly following orders. We're actually playing a part in building a safer and more responsible driving culture in India.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that we're all in this together and that our individual actions have an impact on the safety and well-being of everyone else on the road.
I like that way of looking at it now while we've been focusing a lot on the present. What drivers need to do right now to stay compliant. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the future of vehicle registration and compliance in India.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and something that's constantly evolving. We talked earlier about how technology has the potential to revolutionize this whole landscape.
Yeah, like with online services and the possibility of doing the whole registration process remotely.
Exactly. And as technology continues to advance, we're likely to see even more innovative solutions emerge. Like, imagine a system where vehicle data is automatically collected and updated. You wouldn't have to do any manual paperwork, and there would be less room for errors.
Wow, that sounds incredibly efficient, like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It does, doesn't it? But of course, with every new technology, there are always potential downsides and things we need to be cautious about.
Like what kind of things?
Well, data security is a big one. Any system that's used to store and manage vehicle and driver data has to be extremely secure to protect people's privacy and prevent that information from falling into the wrong hands.
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
We can't just rush into these new technologies without thinking about the potential risks.
Absolutely. And another challenge is ensuring that these new technologies are accessible to everyone in India. Not everyone has the same level of access to technology or the same level of digital literacy. So we need to make sure that these systems are designed in a way that doesn't exclude anyone.
So it's about finding that balance between using technology to make things more efficient and ensuring that the system remains fair and accessible to everyone.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a tough challenge, but it's one that's worth tackling to create a more streamlined and user-friendly experience for drivers all across India.
Now, throughout our conversation today, I've noticed a recurring theme, the importance of transparency.
Yes, definitely.
It's about being transparent with your insurance company, with traffic officers, with the RTO, everyone involved in the process.
Transparency is so crucial for building a fair and efficient system when drivers are upfront about their vehicle details, their driving history. Any incidents that have occurred, it helps to create trust and makes the whole process smoother for everyone involved.
And it goes beyond just avoiding penalties. It's about fostering a sense of accountability and responsibility among drivers.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that we all have a role to play in creating a safer and more harmonious driving environment.
Well said. Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I wanted to touch on one more thing.
Okay, what's that?
We've talked a lot about the rules and regulations, the role of technology, and the importance of transparency. But I think it's important to remember the human element in all of this. Traffic officers, RTO officials, they're all people too.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. We often focus so much on the rules themselves that we forget that there are real people behind the system, people who are responsible for implementing and enforcing those rules.
Exactly. So
Yes.
how can we as drivers contribute to a more positive and constructive interaction with those officials?
Well, for starters, I think it's about approaching these interactions with a sense of mutual respect. Traffic officers and RTO officials, they have tough jobs. They're often dealing with difficult situations. So a little bit of empathy goes a long way.
Yeah, sometimes I forget that they're just trying to do their jobs.
They are. And even simple things like being polite and attentive can make a big difference in how the interaction goes.
It's about recognizing that we're all on the same side. We all want safer roads, smoother processes, and a more responsible driving culture.
Exactly. And when we approach these interactions with a spirit of cooperation and respect, it creates a much more positive experience for everyone involved.
Well said. I think that's a perfect segue into our final segment where we'll share some concluding thoughts and leave our listener with some key takeaways. But first, let's take a quick break to refresh our minds, and then we'll be back to wrap up this deep dive into vehicle registration and compliance in India.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into this whole world of vehicle registration and compliance in India.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
It has. We've really gone through it all, from the basics to some more complex stuff, and hopefully our listeners are feeling a lot more informed and a lot less stressed about the whole process.
That's the goal.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of proactive compliance. Those small steps you take now can save you so much trouble down the road.
Yeah, like those document checks we talked about.
Exactly, and staying informed about any changes to the rules.
And embracing all those online resources that are available.
Right. It's all about making your life as a driver easier and less stressful.
And speaking of stressful, we talked a lot about traffic stops, which can be a little nerve-wracking, even if you're confident you haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah, definitely. But remember, knowledge is power. Knowing your rights, staying calm, and being polite, those things can make a big difference in how those interactions go.
And being prepared, having your documents ready to go.
Absolutely. That can really help to de-escalate the situation.
And if you do think you've been wrongly accused of a violation, you always have the right to contest the challenge.
Right. But do it through the proper channels.
No arguing on the side of the road.
Not a good idea.
So beyond the practical stuff, I think it's important for drivers to remember why these rules and regulations exist in the first place.
Yes. It's not just about avoiding fines, it's about creating a safer and more responsible driving environment for everyone.
When we follow the rules, we're all contributing to that goal.
Exactly. We're all in this together.
And we also talked about the human element. Those traffic officers and RTO officials, they're just people trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And treating them with respect and courtesy can make a big difference in how those interactions go.
It's about creating a more positive and collaborative environment.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one last thing. The future of vehicle registration and compliance in India.
It's going to be interesting to see how things evolve, especially with all the advancements in technology.
Yeah, we talked about the potential for online services, remote registration, even automated data collection.
And while those technologies offer a lot of promise, we also have to be mindful of the potential challenges like data security and ensuring that these systems are accessible to everyone.
So it's a balancing act, finding ways to make the system more efficient and user-friendly while also protecting people's privacy and making sure no one gets left behind.
Exactly. It's going to be a fascinating journey.
It is. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for vehicle registration and compliance in India.
Me too.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything there is to cover on this topic.
I think so.
So for all you Legum doctors out there listening, I hope you found this deep dive helpful and informative. And remember, stay safe out there on the roads.
And happy driving.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive and share it with your friends and fellow Legum doctors.